Draft for a statement of human obligations. Profession of faith. There is a reality outside the world. That is to say, outside space and time, outside man's mental universe, outside any sphere whatsoever that is accessible to human faculties. Corresponding to this reality, at the center of the human heart, is the longing for an absolute good, a longing which is always there and is never appeased by any object in this world. Another terrestrial manifestation of this reality lies in the absurd and insoluble contradictions which are always the terminus of human thought when it moves exclusively in this world. Just as the reality of this world is the sole foundation of facts, so that other reality is the sole foundation of good. That reality is the unique source of all the good that can exist in this world. That is to say, all beauty, all truth, all justice, all legitimacy, all order, and all human behavior that is mindful of obligations. Those minds whose attention and love are turned towards that reality are the sole intermediary through which good can descend from there and come among men. Although it is beyond the reach of any human faculties, man has the power of turning his attention and love towards it. Nothing can ever justify the assumption that any man, whoever he may be, has been deprived of this power. It is a power which is only real in this world insofar as it is exercised. The sole condition for exercising it is consent. This act of consent may be expressed, or it may not be, even tacitly. It may not be clearly conscious, although it has really taken place in the soul. Very often it is verbally expressed, although it has not in fact taken place. But whether expressed or not, the one condition suffices, that it shall in fact have taken place. To anyone who does actually consent to directing his attention and love beyond the world, towards the reality that exists outside the reach of all human faculties, it is given to succeed in doing so. In that case, sooner or later, there descends upon him a part of the good which shines through him upon all that surrounds him. The combination of these two facts, the longing in the depth of the heart for absolute good, and the power, though only latent, of directing attention and love to a reality beyond the world and of receiving good from it, constitutes a link which attaches every man without exception to that other reality. Whoever recognizes that reality recognizes also that link. Because of it, he holds every human being without any exception as something sacred to which he is bound to show respect. This is the only possible motive for universal respect towards all human beings. Whatever formulation of belief or disbelief a man may choose to make, if his heart inclines him to feel this respect, then he in fact also recognizes a reality other than this world's reality. Whoever in fact does not feel this respect is alien to that other reality also. The reality of the world we live in is composed of variety. Unequal objects unequally solicit our attention. Certain people personally attract our attention, either through the hazard of circumstances or some chance affinity. For the lack of such circumstance or affinity, other people remain unidentified. They escape our attention, or at the most, it only sees them as a collectivity. If our attention is entirely confined to this world, it is entirely subject to the effect of these inequalities, which it is all the less able to resist because it is unaware of it. It is impossible to feel equal respect for things that are in fact unequal unless the respect is given to something that is identical in all of them. Men are unequal in all their relations with the things of this world, without exception. The only thing that is identical in all men is the presence of a link with the reality outside the world. All human beings are absolutely identical, insofar as they can be thought of as consisting of a center, which is an unquenchable desire for good, surrounded by an accretion of psychical and bodily matter. Only by really directing the attention beyond the world can there be real contact with this central and essential fact of human nature. Only an attention thus directed possesses the faculty, always identical in all cases, of irradiating with light any human being whatsoever. If anyone possesses this faculty, then his attention is in reality directed beyond the world, whether he is aware of it or not. The link which attaches the human being to the reality outside the world is, like the reality itself, beyond the reach of human faculties. The respect that it inspires as soon as it is recognized cannot be expressed to it. This respect cannot, in this world, find any form of direct expression. But unless it is expressed, it has no existence. There is a possibility of indirect expression for it. The respect inspired by the link between man and the reality outside the world can be expressed to that part of man which exists in the reality of this world. The reality of this world is necessity. The part of man which is in this world is the part which is in the bondage to necessity and subject to the misery of need. The one possibility of indirect expression of respect for the human being is offered by men's needs, the needs of the soul and of the body in this world. It is based upon the connection in human nature between the desire for good, which is the essence of man, and his sensibility. There is never any justification for doubting the existence in any man of this connection. Because of it, when a man's life is destroyed or damaged by some wound or privation of soul or body, which is due to other men's actions or negligence, it is not only his sensibility that suffers, but also his aspiration towards the good. Therefore, there has been sacrilege towards that which is sacred in him. On the other hand, there are cases where it is only a man's sensibility that is affected, for example, where his wound or privation is solely the result of the blind working of natural forces, or where he recognizes that the people who seem to be making him suffer are far from bearing him any ill will, but are acting solely in obedience to a necessity which he also acknowledges. The possibility of indirect expression of respect for the human being is the basis of obligation. Obligation is concerned with the needs in this world of the souls and bodies of human beings, whoever they may be. For each need there is a corresponding obligation. For each obligation, a corresponding need. There is no other kind of obligation, so far as human affairs are concerned. If there seem to be others, they are either false, or else it is only by error that they have not been classed among the obligations mentioned. Anyone whose attention and love are really directed towards the reality outside the world recognizes at the same time that he is bound, both in public and private life, by the single and permanent obligation to remedy, according to his responsibilities and to the extent of his power, all the privations of soul and body which are liable to destroy or damage the earthly life of any human being whatsoever. This obligation cannot legitimately be held to be limited by the insufficiency of power or the nature of responsibilities until everything possible has been done to explain the necessity of the limitation to those who will suffer by it. The explanation must be completely truthful and must be such as to make it possible for them to acknowledge the necessity. No combination of circumstances ever cancels this obligation. If there are circumstances which seem to cancel it as regards a certain man or category of men, they impose it, in fact, all the more imperatively. The thought of this obligation is present to all men, but in very different forms and in very varying degrees of clarity. Some men are more and some are less inclined to accept, or to refuse. It is the rule of their conduct. Its acceptance is usually mixed with self-deception, and even when it is quite sincere, it is not consistently acted upon. To refuse it is to become criminal. The proportions of good and evil in any society depend partly upon the proportion of consent to that of refusal, and partly upon the distribution of power between those who consent and those who refuse. If any power of any kind is in the hands of a man who has not given total, sincere, and enlightened consent to this obligation, such power is misplaced. If a man has willfully refused to consent, then it is in itself a criminal activity for him to exercise any function, major or minor, public or private, which gives him control over other people's lives. All those who, with knowledge of his mind, have acquiesced in his exercise of the function are accessories to the crime. Any state whose official doctrine constitutes an incitement to this crime is itself wholly criminal. It can retain no trace of legitimacy. Any state whose official doctrine is not primarily directed against this crime in all its forms is lacking in full legitimacy. Any legal system which contains no provisions against this crime is without the essence of legality. Any legal system which provides against some forms of this crime but not others is without the full character of legality. Any government whose members commit this crime or authorize it in their subordinates has betrayed its function. Any collectivity, institution, or form of collective life whatsoever whose normal functioning implies or induces the practice of this crime is convicted ipso facto of illegitimacy and should be reformed or abolished. Any man who has any degree of influence, however small, upon public opinion, becomes an accessory to this crime if he refrains from denouncing it whenever it comes to his knowledge, or if he purposefully avoids knowledge of it in order not to have to denounce it. A country is not innocent of this crime if public opinion, being free to express itself, does not denounce any current examples of it, or if freedom of expression being forbidden, this crime is not denounced clandestinely. It is the aim of public life to arrange that all forms of power are entrusted, so far as possible, to men who effectively consent to be bound by the obligation towards all human beings which lies upon everyone, and who understand the obligation. Law is the totality of the permanent provisions for making this aim effective. To understand the obligation involves two things: understanding the principle and understanding its application. Since it is with human needs in this world that the application is concerned, it is for the intelligence to conceive the idea of need and to discern, discriminate, and enumerate, with all the accuracy of which it is capable, the earthly needs of the soul and of the body. This is a study which is permanently open to revision. Statement of obligations. A concrete conception of obligation towards human beings and a subdivision of it into a number of obligations is obtained by conceiving the earthly needs of the body and of the human soul. Each need entails a corresponding obligation. The needs of a human being are sacred. Their satisfaction cannot be subordinated either to reasons of state, or to any consideration of money, nationality, race, or color, or to the moral or other value attributed to the human being in question, or to any consideration whatsoever. There is no legitimate limit to the satisfaction of the needs of a human being except as imposed by necessity and by the needs of other human beings. The limit is only legitimate if the needs of all human beings receive an equal degree of attention. The fundamental obligation towards human beings is subdivided into a number of concrete obligations by the enumeration of the essential needs of the human being. Each need is related to an obligation, and each obligation to a need. The needs in question are earthly needs, for those are the only ones that man can satisfy. They are needs of the soul as well as of the body, for the soul has needs whose non-satisfaction leaves it in a state analogous to that of a starved or mutilated body. The principal needs of the human body are food, warmth, sleep, health, rest, exercise, fresh air. The needs of the soul can for the most part be listed in pairs of opposites which balance and complete one another. The human soul has a need of equality and of hierarchy. Equality is the public recognition, effectively expressed in institutions and manners, of the principle that an equal degree of attention is due to the needs of all human beings. Hierarchy is the scale of responsibilities. Since attention is inclined to direct itself upwards and remain fixed, special provisions are necessary to ensure the effective compatibility of equality and hierarchy. The human soul has a need of consented obedience and of liberty. Consented obedience is what one concedes to an authority because one judges it to be legitimate. It is not possible in relation to a political power established by conquest or coup d'etat, nor to an economic power based upon money. Liberty is the power of choice within the latitude left between the direct constraint of natural forces and the authority accepted as legitimate. The latitude should be sufficiently wide for liberty to be more than a fiction, but it should include only what is innocent and should never be wide enough to permit certain kinds of crime. The human soul has need of truth and of freedom of expression. The need for truth requires that intellectual culture should be universally accessible, and that it should be able to be acquired in an environment neither physically remote nor psychologically alien. It requires that in the domain of thought there should never be any physical or moral pressure exerted for any purpose other than an exclusive concern for truth, which implies an absolute ban on all propaganda without exception. It calls for protection against error and lies, which means that every avoidable material falsehood publicly asserted becomes a punishable offense. It calls for public health measures against poisons in the domain of thought. But, in order to be exercised, the intelligence requires to be free to express itself without control by any authority. There must, therefore, be a domain of pure intellectual research, separate but accessible to all, where no authority intervenes. The human soul has a need of some solitude and privacy, and also of some social life. The human soul has a need both of personal property and collective property. Personal property never consists in the possession of a sum of money, but in the ownership of concrete objects like a house, a field, furniture, tools, which seem to the soul to be an extension of itself and of the body. Justice requires that personal property in this sense should be, like liberty, inalienable. Collective property is not defined by a legal title, but by the feeling among members of a human milieu that certain objects are like an extension or development of the milieu. This feeling is only possible in certain objective conditions. The existence of a social class defined by the lack of personal and collective property is as shameful as slavery. The human soul has a need of punishment and of honor. Whenever a human being, through the commission of a crime, has become exiled from good, he needs to be reintegrated with it through suffering. The suffering should be inflicted with the aim of bringing the soul to recognize freely some day that its infliction was just. This reintegration with the good is what punishment is. Every man who is innocent, or who has finally expiated guilt, needs to be recognized as honorable to the same extent as anyone else. The human soul has need of disciplined participation in a common task of public value, and it has need of personal initiative within this participation. The human soul has need of security, and also of risk. The fear of violence, or of hunger, or of any other extreme evil is a sickness of the soul. The boredom produced by a complete absence of risk is also a sickness of the soul. The human soul, above all, needs to be rooted in several natural environments and to make contact with the universe through them. Examples of natural human environments are a man's country and places where his language is spoken, and places with a culture or historical past which he shares, and his professional milieu, and his neighborhood. Everything which has the effect of uprooting a man or of preventing him from becoming rooted is criminal. Any place where the needs of human beings are satisfied can be recognized by the fact that there is a flowering of fraternity, joy, beauty, and happiness. Wherever people are lonely and turned in on themselves, wherever there is sadness or ugliness, there are privations that need remedying. Practical application. For this statement to become the practical inspiration of the country's life, the first condition is that it should be adopted by the people with that intention. The second condition is that anyone who wields or desires to wield any power of any kind, political, administrative, legal, economic, technical, spiritual, or other, should have to pledge himself to adopt it as his practical rule of conduct. In such cases, the equal and universal character of the obligation is to some extent modified by the particular responsibilities attaching to a particular office. It would therefore be necessary to amplify the pledge with the words, quote, paying special attention to the needs of the human beings who are in my charge, end quote. The violation of such a pledge, either in word or deed, should always in principle be punishable. But in most cases, the institutions and public morals which would make such punishment possible would take several generations to create. Assent to this statement implies a continual effort to bring such institutions and such morals into existence as rapidly as possible.